and we'll be holding additional similar programs at other schools around the country in the fall. If you'd like to learn more about the WITA Academy and our programs, please contact Diego Añez, the Executive Director of the Academy, or go to our website, www.wita.org. As you know, if you've been to any of our 200 webinar panels we've held since the pandemic, we like to call it the names of some of those you're in community with on Zoom, even if you can't see them on screen. So welcome today to Nova Daly at Wiley Ryan, Stephanie Holland at Qualcomm, Jameson Greer at King & Spalding, and Nassim Fussell at Lot 16. Welcome Nova, Stephanie, Jameson, and Nassim. And a shout out to my friend Deborah Wagoner, who retired from Corning after 24 years, who's also on. Welcome, Deborah. It's great to know that you're with us today. We're delighted all of you are here. And of course, if you're watching this live on Zoom, you should have received a copy of today's event program by email so we can dispense with lengthy introductions. You can also ask questions of our panelists using the Q&A tab on Zoom, and we'll try to weave those into the discussion this morning. We have an amazing group of speakers here today, and we're truly honored they're able to make the time to be with us on such short notice. Peter Harrell, attorney at Peter Harrell LLC today, and a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's very recently left the White House, where he was the Senior Director for International Economics and Competitiveness at the National Security Council. Claire Reedy, the Senior Counsel at Arnold and Porter, and a former U.S. Trade Representative for China Affairs. Kellyanne Shaw, partner at Hogan and Lovells and former Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economic Affairs and Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. My good friend Clete Willems, partner at Aiken Gump and a former White House Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economic Affairs. I guess you're getting the trend here. And of course, our moderator, Michael Smart, Managing Director at Rock Creek Global Advisors, and former Director of International Trade and Investment at the National Security Council, and a member of WITA's Board of Directors. Mike?
Thanks, Ken, and thanks to our panelists for joining today. It's a really terrific group. We're going to talk about the hearing that the CCP Select Committee had on Wednesday night on countering China's economic aggression. Want to divide the discussion in four areas based on what was discussed during the hearing. One, U.S. trade policy toward China. Second, U.S. investment policy toward China. Third, U.S. trade and investment policy with other countries in the Asia Pacific. And then maybe four, some thoughts on topics that weren't necessarily addressed, but maybe should be part of the mix as we talk about U.S. policy toward China. Before we get into that, though, I just want to hear from our two former members of House staff, Clete and Kellyanne, a little bit about why the Select Committee is important. Why are we paying attention? After all, this is a committee that does not actually have the authority to report legislation to the House, but it's holding hearings in prime time and is stocked with members from all of the most influential committees. Clete, Kellyanne, can you tell us just a little bit about your impressions of their work so far and how you see them shaping policy going forward?
I can kick it off and give some views there, and it's good to be here this morning. In terms of the committee, I think the reason to pay attention is that this was a major priority for the leadership, was seen as a deliverable when the Republicans took the House, and is really intended to germinate different policy ideas and then to work with the standing committees to try to push those ideas through those bodies. And so what they're going to be doing is coming out of all of these different hearings, they're going to be coming up with a set of policy recommendations that are intended to drive the agenda. So the way I understand it is you're going to have a hearing, and then on the basis of what was discussed, they're going to come up with policy recommendations that they're going to work to move through the standing committee. So these hearings are interesting, they're entertaining, but really at the end of the tunnel, they could lead to real policy. One just quick observation on the committee is I think, right now we've been watching all these hearings. We've got a good group of members, great staff. They've been trying to operate on a bipartisan basis, really substantive conversations, but we don't know yet what we've got. And I think, the one big question for me is coming out of these hearings, are those legislative recommendations going to be balanced? Are they going to reflect a comprehensive approach to China, or are they going to be more one-sided? I think that's a big open question at this point in time.
Kellyanne, anything you'd add?
Yeah, and thank you, WITA, so much for hosting this panel. It's great to be talking about trade with my very esteemed colleagues. And just to say, if I have to make the difficult decision of watching a congressional hearing and the Vanderpump Rules season finale and can't decide, that it is very good TV. So I watched both at the end, but I will say that, the China Select Committee is playing a very important role in Congress at the moment. And what we've seen is that of all of the polarization that is happening in politics, China and issues related to China continue to unite the parties. And I really see the China Select Committee's role as a follow-on to the exercise that happened last year, where you had the consideration of USICA and competes, with varying committees coming up with different ideas to try to come up with a comprehensive U.S. approach to U.S.-China relations. And what was interesting about that process, which ultimately resulted in the CHIPS Act, was the fact that there didn't seem to be any unifying ideology around it. It came across as a potpourri of issues by different congressional committees who were trying to drive change in their respective jurisdictions. And so having something like the China Select Committee be stood up is actually really important, because it is a forum where members who serve on different committees can come together and bring different ideas together, which is what we saw play out in the hearing last night. I think some issues that I will be watching are how the China Select Committee plays with the other committees of jurisdiction, right? There's going to be potentially some turf wars that play out. So far, I understand those relationships are working fairly well, but the committee's pretty new. They've only been established for the last couple of months, and we'll see their recommendations as they roll out and how that unfolds with actual legislation that's introduced. But I do think they're playing an important role, and they're a really important forum for conversations about where we take this relationship.
Thank you. That's a great setting of the stage. Let's jump in now to the topics that were discussed during the hearing itself, beginning with trade policy. Now, this primetime hearing, as all primetime hearings must, began with a video, and it was all about China's participation in the WTO. And it began with Ambassador Charlene Barshevsky sort of wildly shaking hands with her Chinese counterpart as they concluded the accession negotiations, had clips from President Clinton and President Bush talking about the benefits of China's WTO accession before transitioning into these somber news reports about expanding industrial subsidies and IP theft and China not joining the government procurement agreement. The clear implication, right, was that it was a mistake to facilitate accession and that the U.S. had been had. So it wasn't surprising when members asked Ambassador Lighthizer, should we revoke China's permanent normal trade relations, which the U.S. was obligated to do when China joined the WTO. He was emphatic in his answer, saying Congress absolutely should do this. And he thought that a big majority would be voting in favor if it were ever brought to a vote. So Claire, I'm going to begin with you. Tell us what it would mean if the U.S. Would actually revoke PNTR for China. What are the consequences? And would it be, as Ambassador Lighthizer said, the best thing the United States could do for American manufacturing? Start with Claire, and then we'll turn to others.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to WITA for putting this together today. It's critical when we're dealing with China to be sophisticated, to be savvy, and to be very skeptical of their intentions when we're setting policy, because China is a major country that zones in like an arrow, pursuing its own interests however it can, and doesn't adhere to our norms. But if we're going to be savvy, we really have to be clear about where the risks lie, what unintended consequences are, and then we take smart action. And I think actually Eric Schmidt quietly countered Lighthizer suggestion that removing PNTR would be a really good idea. Because here's the brutal reality, and we have to be brutally realistic. We're in a global trading system with a lot of players. So we're not in a situation where it's just the US and China, and we're not in a situation where the US is dominant over China. That means US unilateral actions can't dictate global trade outcomes. So if we remove PNTR and we raise tariffs on economic relations with China, the other key economies are not going to follow us. They're going to continue to trade in ordinary goods and services. And that means big players like Japan, South Korea, the EU, et cetera, they're going to step in and take the profits and take the economic advantages. So the result is going to be, in a unilateral move like this, that we reduce the living standards in the United States, that we make it much more expensive for ordinary people to buy ordinary goods and ordinary industry inputs. US becomes a less attractive place to invest because costs are higher, and we lose jobs. Companies will go to the other jurisdictions. They'll have lower costs for their inputs. They'll have more markets for their goods and more investment in their countries. So I don't think removing PNTR is a good idea. It sure is a hell of a political slogan and a great bumper sticker. It demonstrates how strongly skeptical you are about China and how you don't want to be taken for a ride. But we can't take the United States for a ride either with a slogan. We've got to be a lot smarter and more sophisticated in how we move.
That's great. Cleet.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in and say, first, I think everyone listening needs to recognize that this is a legitimate policy threat for the reasons that you described, right? I mean, everyone in Congress essentially believes that we did not get what we thought out of the deal when China joined the WTO. Listeners may disagree with that. That's the view in Congress. And then when you ask them, do we want to continue to provide China with special treatment? I mean, the answer is no. So they are looking to change the relationship with China in a fundamental way. So we have to all be aware of what a real threat this is. Second point, I think we have to realize how catastrophic it actually would be for the relationship if we revoke PNTR. I mean, this is not sort of an incremental, kind of like 301. This is a kill shot in the relationship. And let me give you some numbers here. Under the 301 tariffs, of the top 10 imports from China, we have not touched the top 4 imports from China. The 5th import is routers. We have a 7.5% tariff on that. And then there are 2 more out of the top 10 lists that are either tariffed right now at 7.5% or 25%. Okay, so 3 out of the top 10 at relatively low rates. You revoke PNTR, you're talking about 35 to 40% tariffs on all 10. On all 10. I mean, it makes what we've done on 301 look like child's play. So it is massive to the relationship. I mean, the Trump administration under Ambassador Lighthizer decided not to tariff these goods because of the impact they would have on the economy and consumers. Last point I'll make, and I thought this was interesting, given how catastrophic it was, some of us may have been surprised that Ambassador Lighthizer said it's not enough. We need to go beyond that and raise tariffs beyond column 2 and create this new column 3. But I thought what was interesting about that conversation is it was sort of an implicit recognition that going to column 2 tariffs for China is suboptimal, that it actually wouldn't achieve our goals. Those are not the ideal tariffs to have on China. And I'm hoping that will start this debate about, let's not just maintain the status quo and call anyone who wants to move it weak, or let's not just say, let's revoke PNTR and go into column 2, but let's actually look tariff by tariff. Let's use the ITC report that came out, figure out which tariffs are helping us achieve our strategic goals, which are hurting us, and modify tariffs accordingly. That's the kind of responsible conversation I'm hoping we can get out of this debate.
Kellyanne.
Sure, love to jump in here. So this discussion about PNTR really goes to a debate that was happening during the hearing on Wednesday that Representative Kim's questioning teased out. And this is whether we're going to refer to this process that's happening with China. And I agree with Cleet, the relationship with China is going to change economically. Either Congress or the administration will do something. That's where the politics are going. So where are we going? I think there are two paths. And one was expressed by Chairman Gallagher when he referred to the process of de-risking. And that choice of words was very intentional. And it contrasted with what Ambassador Lighthizer was saying, which is strategic decoupling. So are these two paths that we can take? And in Mr. Kim's questioning, he was saying, okay, Ambassador Lighthizer, I hear that you're saying you want to, across the economy, across every product, whether strategic or not, take action to be less dependent on China. And as Cleet said, you want to do these other things as well. So this is more or less a comprehensive decoupling strategy. And he said yes. And then he turned to Eric Schmidt and asked the same question. And he said, no, I actually want to be more strategic about it. I want to pick certain sectors, AI and other places of sensitive technology. And that's where we do the de-risking. And so you have to listen very carefully when you hear members of Congress talk about it and decide which phrase they're using to describe this, whether it's a de-risking approach or a strategic decoupling approach. What I'll also note, too, is that there was a Ways and Means hearing, I think it was last week, where Ways and Means Chairman Smith used the phrase strategic decoupling. And that was actually the first time I had heard that phrase until Ambassador Lighthizer used it during the China Select Committee. And so now you have some context and definition about how different members may be thinking about this. But there are actually legislative proposals on PNTR right now. Both Senators Cotton and Hawley have separate bills. Hawley's would effectively say we're getting rid of MFN tariffs, go straight to column 2. What Senator Cotton's bill would do would say, okay, we're going to go back to the old system where the president can make a recommendation on an annual basis and expand the human rights and other type of consideration that have to go into making that determination. Either way, I think you get to the same place if you decide to take that move anyway, because of the political climate that we're in. But this is a real debate that's happening right now over PNTR. And if you support PNTR, you should probably be in the camp of saying we need to decouple across the entire economy. If that's not where you are, if you're in the more of de-risking for specific sectors, PNTR is not going to get you there. And it's like taking a sledgehammer to a nail in that case. So, I can see why Ambassador Lighthizer was recommending it, given his views that we should have a broader decoupling across our economy. But if that's not your view, you're going to take a different approach.
And can I just say that it was interesting because Lighthizer at one point said he did not believe in complete decoupling because it wasn't realistic. But then the specific comments that he made, Kellyanne, were much closer to, we're gonna basically freeze things across the board. So there's a little inconsistency even in his statements.
Yeah, but if you listen carefully to him, because Claire, I caught that too, and thought that was quite interesting. He didn't use the phrase decoupling. He said economic relations. I'm not espousing a ceasing of all economic relations. But now this phrase strategic decoupling is the new term of art that has been injected into the conversation. And sort of the other point I'll make, and Mike, this is totally off topic from your original question at this point. But one thing the Trump administration was very successful at doing was changing the conversation in Washington. We went from not talking about tariffing in the terms of hundreds of billions of dollars with China, not talking about all of the anti-competitive, unfair trade practices that China was engaged in. Now everyone accepts that. And so he's taking the conversation a step further with a lot of the ideas that he talked about. You can query whether or not if he were USTR, he would actually implement those policies. But nevertheless, they're now part of the conversation. And I think there's something that we're going to have to discuss seriously.
Excellent. I had a couple of other trade topics, but I really want to move to investment policy now and to bring in Peter, because that was much discussed during the hearing. And Ambassador Lighthizer, as well as Roger Robinson, talked about the need to severely restrict investment flows in both directions, inbound into the United States and outbound from the United States to China. Now, on the inbound side, we know what that regime looks like. There are those who say it needs to be tightened up in various ways. But the outbound regime is entirely new. We've never really done that outside the context of sort of traditional sanctions and SDN lists, et cetera. And so, Peter, orient us on the policy issues that are at stake in these conversations. Why are we looking to review, restrict outbound investment? You hear arguments on national security or the morality of supporting certain activities in China or economic competitiveness. Tell us about what's at stake. And then if you would, give us your take on the various approaches that are out there right now, whether it's congressional legislation on the National Critical Capabilities Defense Act, kind of it's been around for a while, Casey Cornyn, as well as what you can say about what the administration is thinking, again, both on objectives and on the tools that would be applied. Over to Peter.
And thanks. And like my other panelists, I'd like to thank WITA and you for pulling this together. And I want to start with one of the comments you made, which is there was certainly a lot of discussion on investment at the hearing. Frankly, I knew there'd be interest in investment when I started watching the hearing Wednesday night, but there's more interest in investment, more discussion of investment than I was expecting myself. And I think in terms of the substance, the hearing really brought home a couple of important debates that are going on in Washington right now about the U.S.-China investment relationship, both about U.S. investment in China, the outbound side, but also, as you said, Michael, there's some debate about whether and how to potentially further restrict Chinese investment here in the U.S. In terms of outbound investment, U.S. investment in China, I think the hearing definitely brought home the fact that there is quite strong bipartisan support for at least some limits on U.S. investment in China. But as you suggested in your opening remarks on this topic, Michael, it also brought home the kind of scope of the very lively debate that is out there about what particular limits on U.S. investment in China should be. And I'd say there you could really see from the discussion on Wednesday night a couple of different views, both sort of philosophical views and then also policy views regarding the scope of outbound investment. So I think, one view you heard last night, which I think Eric Schmidt talked about, Wednesday night, that I think Eric Schmidt talked about, and which is also broadly where I think the Biden-Harris administration on this is that the goal of restricting U.S. investments in China should principally be about kind of ensuring that U.S. investments in China and kind of high technology sectors are not undermining an American national goal of maintaining our edge in those sectors. So you saw sort of Eric talking about, maybe it would be appropriate to limit some investments in, AI and quantum and some of these sort of strategic technologies where he thinks you wouldn't want to see China sort of U.S. Facilitate China gaining an edge in those technologies. But Eric was not talking about broader restrictions on investment. I think on the other hand, you saw Roger and frankly, former USTR Lighthizer embrace a broader view of restrictions on outbound investment that would not just target a couple of sectors, but that are frankly designed to discourage American capital investment in China writ large. So you saw a fair amount of discussion of various proposals in Congress that would effectively restrict U.S. pension funds from investing in China fairly broadly, including investing in the publicly traded equities of Chinese companies. Obviously, there are currently a couple of Chinese, maybe 50 or 80 Chinese companies where there are investment restrictions on a company by company basis, but you saw some discussion of these proposals to really broaden that out to keep pension investment out of China more broadly, really on a framework of we want to deny China access to American capital more broadly. And I think it's going to be interesting and important over the next couple of months to see how this debate plays out. And in particular, I think it'll be important to watch, assuming the Biden administration comes out with its planned and long debated targeted restrictions on certain investments in China, next month or over the summer. does the Biden administration action kind of sate the appetite in Congress to act on this issue, or does it actually whet the appetite in Congress to do something substantially broader than what the Biden administration does? I think it's going to be important to watch that. One final point on outbound that I think kind of got lost in some of the discussion. So Roger and a couple of the members talked about this idea of putting large numbers of Chinese companies on the US SDN list. So there was this idea about putting companies that currently DOD is identified as being military linked or that are on the BIS entity list on the SDN list. And I think the debate on Wednesday night really didn't bring home or highlight enough just how dramatic the impact of those actions would be. I mean, if you took, the major Chinese technology companies, telecoms companies, the major Chinese energy companies, and you put them on the US SDN list, which would effectively prohibit all investment, all business with those companies, not just investment. I think you'd actually find it very hard for American companies to operate in China. And I think that would actually be a much more dramatic action in terms of its impact on American business operations in China than kind of the debate Wednesday night brought out. Obviously, there's also discussion on the inbound side, but we can talk about that in the questions section.
Maybe you can take up the question of whether the EO is going to sate or whet the appetite of Congress, as well as other things you want to address.
Sure, I will do that. Let me just sort of put a finer point on some of the things that Peter said and sort of how I saw the recommendations coming out of this hearing. I mean, I thought there was pretty clear support for restricting capital flows to military companies. And I want to, Peter makes a really good point about how you do this is important. I think there's clearly a need to expand CMIC. Right now, it only applies to publicly traded securities. And I think there's a really good argument to be made. If I can't buy a publicly traded security in a military company, I shouldn't be able to provide them debt or private equity financing. And so I think that there's interest there. I think Andy Barr's questioning got to that question. I agree with Peter. Going all the way to an SDN is a step too far. I think there's an incremental half step that's additive to the current US toolkit, which would be take CMIC, expand that to private equity and things like that, but don't go to SDN because that's going to totally disrupt supply chains. I also thought there was some support, and this is the Eric Schmidt exchange, for this notion of having financing and know-how going to innovation and innovative technologies, which I think is where the administration's EO is going to come down. I think that will be generally received okay. There's going to be folks who are upset in Congress that it's done through an EO. But like, as I understand it, it's going to be fairly narrow. It's going to focus on innovative technologies. So I think that will be generally okay received on the Hill. I think where it gets much more controversial are this question of all pension funds passive investment into China. I don't know. I mean, Gallagher seems very interested in that, but I don't know how you come up with a rec there that's not just really disruptive to the whole sort of architecture of investment. And then lastly, where I don't think that there's support across the Congress and where McHenry and others will definitely oppose it is going as far as sort of the Rosa DeLauro legislation, formerly known as Casey Cornyn, because the difference there is we're not talking about innovative technologies. We're not talking about financial flows. We're talking about managing supply chain decisions of US companies across the Chinese economy. And I think that kind of social engineering is not where we want to go. And I think that there are better ways. If you're interested in supply chain resilience issues, there's better ways to address them, like trade agreements. And I know we're going to get to that later.
Great. Kellyanne.
Yeah, one thing that really struck me, like less on the outbound, but more on the inbound conversation, was the recommendation that we should restrict all Chinese investment in the United States unless it could be shown that somehow it was good for the US economy. I mean, that was pretty radical in terms of a proposal. And there wasn't a lot of back and forth on it, but I just noted that it was a very interesting view that I had not quite heard expressed by anybody before. Certainly there are proposals right now, and we saw quite a few members engage on the farmland issue in terms of CFIUS reform. That's certainly something that's on the mind of members, but that would be a pretty radical departure from anything that we currently have in terms of the inbound investment screening.
Yeah, I agree. When they go there, they really open themselves up to the criticism that we are going in the direction of the Chinese, sort of command and control approach. I think that tends to bite. Let's move on to the
Michael, can I just make one small
Claire,
comment? One of the interesting things that an economist friend of mine said was, it's very odd that, again, from an actual economic impact perspective, to be fussing too much about U.S. money flows to China, because China has a ton of money. So if you're going to put your energy into a policy that's going to have an impact, I think there's a lot more sympathy for an Eric Schmidt technology cutting edge, the old small yard high fence, as being much more effective against China, rather than taking the little stream of US funds into China and trying to spend your time doing something about that.
Thank you, Claire. So let's move on to the third topic, which is, what is U.S. policy vis-a-vis the rest of the region and the rest of the world, for that matter? There was a really interesting exchange between Congressman Johnson and Ambassador Lighthizer, where Johnson said, look, we are going to do less with China. I get it. We're not going to sell them as many soybeans, but doesn't that mean we have to do more with the rest of the world, including free trade agreements with allies and partners? And that seemed to stump Ambassador Lighthizer for a minute. He didn't want to say anything bad about the allies, but he said, look, we can do various things to improve coordination with those countries, trade facilitations, customs, et cetera, all to the good. But where I draw the line is increasing access to the US market by cutting our tariffs. That we should not do. And it struck me that sounded very similar, different words, as the one that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan described at Brookings. And so my question for you all, and whoever would like to go first, please do, is, does this represent kind of a new bipartisan consensus around sort of these smaller gauge agreements? In other words, are the more comprehensive trade liberalizing, investment liberalizing agreements a thing of the past? And if that's true, how effective is that approach as we seek to, as the hearing was titled, counteract the economic influence of China? Who'd like to go first?
All right. Oh no, Peter. I got a lot to say, but let's hear from you first.
You were first. You go first, and then I'll chime in. All right, fine. I'll just make a minute of short remarks on this, and I look forward, Cleet, to hearing your comments. So first, Michael, I agree. This was actually, I think, one of the most interesting exchanges of the evening, was to see how Ambassador Lighthizer kind of basically came out and, as you suggested, in many ways agreed with the position the Biden administration has taken of we shouldn't actually be doing traditional market access, U.S. market access focused trade deals here. And I think he made a couple of, fair factual points on that, right? He noted that Vietnam, with which the U.S. does not have a trade agreement, has nonetheless seen a surge in exports to the United States. Something like a quarter of their economy, I think he argued, consists of exports to the United States. And so, he's kind of arguing, actually, a bunch of these countries already have significant market access to the U.S. And I think he also then, made the point that sort of further market access shouldn't come at the cost of U.S. jobs. I think what his argument, and he also argued, I think importantly, that he thinks, sort of free trade agreements with these countries won't actually, and he quoted the Beatles, buy me love, and the sort of idea that we're going to deepen strategic relationships with FTAs just to him doesn't kind of actually add up in the real world. I think one thing, though, his argument overlooked is actually the genesis of the question, which is kind of market access for American firms in these countries. Because I do think there's a reality. I think he is correct. And I think the Biden administration is operating on this assumption that, look, you can have interesting and constructive talks with countries in the Indo-Pacific without market access, right? You can talk about trade facilitation. You can have nice kind of diplomatic powwows. You can kind of send signals to the market about your where investment might be welcome. But I think what is hard to do when you're not prepared to put U.S. market access on the table or other major incentives from the United States is to get these countries to change their domestic laws to make market access to their markets easier, right? So I think you can actually have these strategic discussions without FTAs, but I don't think you're going to see a lot of foreign market liberalization without the U.S. also putting something on the table.
And
Yeah.
sorry,
So
could you
first-
also? Oh, sorry, Clete, go ahead.
No, Mike, sorry.
I was only going to say if you could also talk about the absence of market access being on the table, not just in terms of opening foreign markets, but also in advancing some of the standards that we think are important.
Yeah. So first, let me just say, I don't think there is bipartisan consensus on this point. And I cannot tell you how many members I talk to who are frustrated with the lack of a positive trade agenda for the United States. And if you want to cultivate partners and allies to counter China, if you want to move supply chains out of China, if you want to create a more innovative economy in the United States, you've got to be doing trade agreements. It's that simple. And I think there's a lot of frustration on both sides of the aisle about that. I mean, I look at the exchange with Dusty Johnson. It was very clear from his remarks that he's frustrated. LaHood, Michelle Steele, Jake Auchincloss has talked about this quite a bit. So I don't think there's bipartisan consensus on this point. Now, why is it important? I mean, again, Johnson talked a lot about the need to increase exports, and certainly that is part of this. The second point I'll make is on supply chain. And there was an exchange on Vietnam, but it wasn't as detailed as it should be. We often think about, okay, what are we going to get in from Vietnam? But let's think about the decision-making for a company in Vietnam. Right now, Vietnam has a trade deal with China. If they're deciding, am I going to source an input for manufacturing an IT product or something from either Vietnam or the United States, they can either get it for China at a 0% tariff, or they can get it from the United States and it's going to cost them 20 or 30% at the border. They're going to make the decision to buy it from China. And so if you don't counteract that tariff differential, you are going to make it easier for China to link supply chains with key swing states in the region like Vietnam. And that's why that's so important. And then let's talk about the atmospheric. I can't tell you how many times I hear from Indo-Pacific countries, you give us lectures, China gives us bridges and trade agreements. And so the US really needs to put something on offer on this region. And the last point I'll make here is I feel like this conversation about market access is really we're talking about the wrong thing, right? And Ambassador Tai, Ambassador Lighthizer, Jake Sullivan, they all talk about the US has lowered all of its rates and the rest of the world hasn't done the same, and therefore we need a new trade policy. And their concern is really with the decision we made when we joined the WTO and when we negotiated bound rates. We have an unequal starting point through the WTO. And there are two ways to fix that. Either you can go back to the WTO and say, I want to renegotiate my bound rates and raise ours to meet the rest of the world, or you can do FTAs in which we bring them both down together. Now, I think the better answer is to do the FTAs, but quite frankly, the notion that because our tariff rates are lower than the rest of the world, therefore we shouldn't do trade agreements is a complete red herring. It completely misses the point. If you're upset about the lack of reciprocity, your answer is FTAs.
Kellyanne.
Yeah, well, I think this is a really important exchange and certainly an important issue to think through. And again, I think it does come down to semantics in some way, right? Because Ambassador Lighthizer was also clear in his remarks. I'm all for an offensive trade strategy. And the two of them, Johnson and Lighthizer, seem to be talking past each other, as you saw in that exchange, right? He was like, well, what about market access? And again, as Peter pointed out, Ambassador Lighthizer responded as if he was talking about U.S. domestic market access, as opposed to, achieving more from other markets abroad. I do think that trade agreements in some form have to be part of the U.S. trade strategy. There is no way around it. I mean, with all due respect to the current administration's efforts on IPEF, at the end of the day, it may not be worth more than the paper it's written on if they're not enforceable rules with the ability to impose penalties for countries that violate those rules, right? And so we can't build a trade strategy on that. We can't build a trade strategy on mere discussions. And so from that perspective, we very much need to look at what is our concept of a trade agreement. We don't want to call it a free trade agreement because that's offensive to some people. Okay, we'll call it something else. But what is our economic relationship with our allies? And I think there is some frustration that is warranted, which Peter will appreciate as well, having served on both the National Security Council and the National Economic Council. And sometimes when you're talking to your friends on the national security side, they will say, listen, it's Europe, it's the UK, they're our allies, we just need to do an FTA. And everyone on the economic side looks at that and says, wait, why would we do that? They are discriminating against our sectors here. If we do that, it's going to hurt our workers in this particular state or in this particular product. Like, we're just not going to give it away because they're our friends. But there's somewhere in the middle where we can go with all of this, right? We can negotiate deals that do not hurt US workers. We can open up market access in areas where we're not sensitive to it. And frankly, we've got lots of options to do it and to get that product elsewhere. We can be strategic in how we do it. I don't think we have to negotiate bad deals. So from that perspective, I'm in favor of FTAs, and I think it makes sense in the Indo-Pacific and anywhere where we have a strategic interest. But there is a way to square the perspective from Representative Johnson and Ambassador Lighthizer, which is we just negotiate better deals that don't look like the old ones that didn't work.
Thank you, Kellyanne. I'm going to go to audience questions in just a minute, but one issue that I did not hear, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think I heard a mention of TikTok, the Restrict Act. This was all the rage a month ago, right? And then, of course, you had a fair amount of political backlash from left, right, and center against the Restrict Act and the authority that it would give to the Secretary of Commerce. Where are we on dealing with Chinese connected apps and other things that Congress and the administration have devoted a lot of time to, but didn't really seem to come up in the hearing?
Are you guys really that shy? I know this group. Claire, I'll weigh in, but Claire, you came off, so.
All right, you go first.
They're working through it. I mean, I think that the House is divided on this issue. And if you saw about a week and a half ago, Patrick McHenry wrote a letter with Tim Scott to the Biden administration that basically said, we don't need the Restrict Act. You should use the existing EO to try to get ByteDance to divest. And that's where I think the House, there are those like McHenry who believe in that approach. And then there's Gallagher and McCall and others who want to, go further and ban it outright. And so I think you have a little bit of a divide in the House. And as I understand the way this committee is operating, it's trying to keep things bipartisan where they actually think they're going to get something done. And so where they don't have consensus, they're not going to spend quite as much time. I will say the thing to watch is over in the Senate. The Restrict Act is getting attacked for being, both too broad and too narrow at the same time. There are those on the conservative side who believe it's too big of an expansion of government. And I would just say to them, I think it's better that Congress steps in and legislates rather than having us operate under an IEPA-based EO that has no guardrails on how we do this thing. So their critique is it's too big for government, but I would just say is the better alternative to do an EO. And then the other critique is that it doesn't move fast enough on TikTok. And I think that as I understand it, they're trying to, Warner's trying to convince Cantwell to take this up. Thune is trying to get more cover from the right. to sort of try to get support for this. And they're trying to work it through the committee as part of Schumer's deal, but there's still work to go. So quick answer, to summarize, it's, there's still energy and interest there, but people are all over the place on what they want to do. And that's, I think, complicated it.
Claire, and then Peter, I'd love to hear your perspective on this as well.
That's what I was going to say, is that a lot of these things with China turn out to be a lot more complicated in terms of executing something that makes sense. So I think we're stuck with more people having thought about it, and therefore more opinions, and therefore it's taken a while.
Yeah, I agree that it is taking a while, and I sort of always expected a legislative process here would take a while. I mean, right, this is a big and complicated issue, and it is very appropriate that it kind of, go through a complicated legislative process. That said, I'm kind of where Cleet is, and that I don't think this issue is going away. I think it didn't come up last night or on Wednesday night, in large part just because of kind of the witnesses who were there. I mean, Eric could have been asked about it, but, the other two witnesses, Roger and Ambassador Lighthizer, less their issue. So I think it was partly a witness issue and partly just a kind of what was on the mood of the committee. But I don't think the TikTok issue is going anywhere. I think this is going to grind through Congress this year. And I also think, and I'd read the Tim Scott and McHenry letter, and I'm where Cleet is. I think this idea that you can do things under existing executive branch authority, on the one hand, sort of creates a potential of a really big government monster, right? Where the U.S. government under existing authorities can kind of do anything, which I think is a little bit I think would be an unfortunate outcome. And B, I also think it overestimates the current state of the law, right? I mean, we obviously found back in 2020 courts enjoined efforts to ban TikTok under IEPA. I think that, sort of implementing, I just think there'd be some real challenges in terms of implementing the CFIUS divestment order that was given back in 2020. And so I think this is an area where actually it is very appropriate for Congress to legislate. I think it's important that Congress legislate, and I think it is fair that Congress take a little bit of time to get that legislation right.
Terrific. Let me jump to two audience questions that we have so far. One person notes that Ambassador Lighthizer, when he spoke about 301 tariffs, basically said that we should expand them, apply them to all imports, raise the rates until we eliminate our trade deficit with China. And the questioner asked, what's the likelihood that Congress, that would appeal to them? If I could just jump in to say, I didn't hear anybody race to embrace that particular idea. But it does bring me to the phase one deal, which was also discussed. And Cleet and Kellyanne have a lot of experience with phase one. The criticism was made by members, by Lighthizer, that China is not living up to the agreement and that the Biden administration has been asleep at the switch in enforcing it. And Lighthizer was very clear, we should take a 301 action to enforce our rights under that agreement and raise tariffs, whether it's because they didn't meet their purchasing commitments or other provisions of that agreement. Cleet, Kellyanne, is there a violation? You guys should know better than anyone. Peter, what was the discussion about enforcement of phase one while you were in government? Over to you all.
Okay, I'll jump in. So phase one had a couple of different components. It had substantive components related to intellectual property and other commitments, which China has largely worked through, as I understand from talking to people in the current administration who are monitoring these issues quite closely. There were also the purchasing commitments, and I think it's pretty clear they did not meet those purchasing commitments. Right, so you sign a deal, the deal should be enforced. My own perception is that China does not believe the Biden administration is going to do anything to enforce the deal. So there wasn't a lot of impetus to meet those particular thresholds and topics or thresholds and goals. So the deal is just kind of out there and it's languishing. It still exists in some form. Nobody has withdrawn, but clearly the targets have not been met. What can you do to enforce it? There is this dispute settlement mechanism where you can have consultations at different levels, but ultimately the goal is to withdraw from the deal and ultimately tariff. It's a unilateral decision that would be taken by the US or China if either side believed the other was violating the terms of the agreement. So effectively what Ambassador Lighthizer is saying is we should call out China for not meeting its commitments and add tariffs to the relationship. And that was what was contemplated under phase one if there was not a meeting of China by the thresholds. But I welcome Peter's view as to how the administration considered that. Please tell me I'm wrong in terms of enforcement, but would love to hear what my colleagues say.
Look, I don't think I'm going to comment on some of the internal deliberations in the administration. And I think you all can understand why I'd want to avoid doing that. But let me make a sort of a policy point. And I think here's an area where probably Cleet and I are in a lot of agreement, which is I think the reality is, regardless of sort of phase one implementation or appeal, the reality is U.S. tariffs on China are here to stay. And what the administration should be thinking about is how to strategically adjust those tariffs so the actual tariff regime we have is in U.S. national interest. And I have long thought, as a personal matter, that the right outcome here is less around sort of focusing on the phase today, is less around looking historically at the phase one deal and did they comply or did they not comply, or how would we adjust the phase one deal, and instead having a conversation about, okay, what are the areas where we actually want to encourage some de-risking from China by hiking tariffs, for example, on kind of strategic technologies and, import dependencies that we might have from China? And what are some areas where actually we don't think these are strategic, or frankly, where, U.S. imports of some intermediate inputs for U.S. manufacturing might actually be against our self-interest, and let's lower the tariffs in those sectors. So I think we should actually not look kind of retroactively so much as let's take where we are today and look forward on where we should be with the tariffs.
Great. Two other audience questions. Is decoupling actually happening between the U.S. and China, or are companies just hunkering down to try to wait this out? Second, are we taking enough into account China's ability to retaliate against U.S. measures in ways that hurt the U.S. economy?
Yeah, I'll jump in, and I want to just quickly comment on the previous question and say I think Peter is right, and really I draw a major distinction between list 1 and 2, which we spent over a year trying to design. We had a complicated algorithm trying to measure substitutability and things like that. And so if you're going to modify the tariffs, the answer is not just more tariffs and everything. The answer is be more strategic about it. I also think whether it's an enforcement action under the phase one deal or anything else, the next time we use 301, maybe we don't need to be a one-trick pony and only think tariffs are the only option under that statute. I mean, I think there's been conversations, mostly nascent, about fees on services and different things like that might be a more surgical approach to dealing with some of the problems of many of our trading partners. And I also say, look, I think it's pretty clear China isn't living up to all of the deal. Their implementation has been uneven. There's a lot of references in the NTE where they aren't meeting commitments. But I think the administration needs to be more transparent. I'd like to see a phase one report card so we can assess where they meet it, where they haven't, and make decisions on how to proceed. Question of decoupling. I'm hopeful we can continue to draw a distinction between national security, sensitive sectors, and things like that, and the rest of the economy. You generally hear that rhetoric, but sometimes, as this conversation has alluded, the policies don't remain consistent with that rhetoric. But I mean, again, I think if we can manage it, there are areas where we're going to have to cut off trade flows, we're going to have to cut off financial flows, and I think we need to recognize that. But let's work hard to define that in a narrow, strategic kind of way. And then for the rest of it, let's do as much trade as we can. And I think that's important not only for the economy, but also for the broader relationship. And, I worry about the trajectory we're on, that it gets increasingly adversarial. And so if we can keep some of that line of communication and exchange open, I think that's in our interests for other reasons as well.
Anybody want to come in on the China retaliation, the leverage that they have over us in certain sectors?
I will. But I also want to briefly go back to the phase one deal and make the point that there were some commitments that China met that were valuable, including a huge array of them in the agriculture sector, for example, as well as some other things. If we trash the phase one deal by going in and pressing aggressively and China withdraws, which is what can happen, then we also lose all of that. So we need to think about, in addition, I agree that we ought to be looking forward, and I have the sense that that's the approach that's being taken with the 301 review that the administration is taking on. I do think we need to be careful a little bit about the baby in the bathwater. With regard to China retaliation, I think the 301 sort of sequence of events demonstrates that China is going to retaliate. So that's part of their core DNA, because otherwise they would be humiliated and lose face, and they're not going to do that. I think it's also pretty clear that the United States is not so dominant in the world economy that it is going to be able to totally shrug off China retaliation. Although, again, it's a big world, so we'll manage just like China managed has managed against us. In terms of impact on the U.S. economy, I think unless you look at a drastic scenario like China really providing major assistance to Russia and Ukraine, or the outside scenario of China invading Taiwan, that we're not going to get to a place where Chinese actions are going to have a broad impact on the U.S. economy, but it certainly could make certain sectors of the U.S. Economy unhappy and create some harms. And I do think that U.S. companies operating in China need to be extremely conscious of the fact that China's focus on national security and nationalism is going to mean that that outside companies are going to be used by China to the extent they're useful, and they will be discarded as soon as they're not.
Terrific. Thank you, Claire. I want to close with a question to Peter. As we speak, G7 leaders are meeting in Hiroshima. Peter, you've spent a lot of time with our allies talking about China policy. Can you just give us a high-level sense? Where do we share an assessment of the risks? Where do we share an assessment of the kinds of measures that are necessary to address those risks? And where is there some divergence?
Yeah, so I appreciate the question. Look forward to seeing the final communiques coming out of Tokyo. I think the story of the last couple of years, not just the last sort of 2 years, but frankly, the last year or two of the Trump administration as well, has actually been one of greater convergence between the U.S. and its kind of core G7 allies on what the risks we face from China are. And I think, you've seen that both in terms of kind of rhetorical statements, right? I mean, a month or two ago, we saw Valdis Dombrovskis, the EU trade minister, talk about the risk of European investment in China and sort of the importance of looking at that in a targeted way. But I also think we've seen it, with our European friends have, enacted things like an anti-subsidy instrument in Europe and their actions they're taking. So I think there is a lot of convergence on both kind of the economic risks we're facing from China and also a growing convergence about, the geopolitical risks could be real. I think there's still debates over how significant, but that there could be geopolitical risks. I think, though, a lot of work does continue to need to be done in the implementation of that, where, a number of our allies would take a much kind of more narrow and targeted approach to some of these measures than certainly we heard discussed Wednesday night at the committee. And I think in particular, Europe remains and other countries remain much more wary of tariffs than we do. It's been interesting. I think in some ways there's more convergence on, investments and export controls than there has been on tariffs. And it'll be interesting to see if there's greater convergence on that front going forward.
Thank you, Peter. Ken, your presence tells me we're at time. Let me turn it over to you.
I came on late just because I was enjoying the conversation so much, and I think our audience has really stuck around. for the whole session. So really terrific conversation to all. Thank you to all of you. Really grateful for your making the time. Really, there's so many important issues and it's so many implications to these conversations that go so much further than just the CCP in the United States. There's so many other countries, the impact on our global relations, obviously, the things that are happening domestically and internationally. And so really just appreciate you all helping us kind of look at all these important questions. Really appreciate it. I hope that we can maybe have you guys on back again, kind of a kitchen cabinet we can convene on a regular basis when these hearings take place to maybe discuss some of these issues. So really thank you very, very much.